What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we've got more Destiny 2 Final Shape news. And in this one, Bungie go ahead and give us a preview of a whole bunch of sandbox changes coming specifically for weapons in the expansion. So, as always, we do get exotic buffs and nerfs, as well as weapon archetype changes and adjustments to perks, mods, and a few other elements which we'll touch on in the video. But Bungie have also gone ahead and shared a preview for the Kvostov exotic auto rifle, which is coming back in the expansion as well. So we'll round it all up in the video, guys. As always, I hope you enjoy this one, and if you do, a rating below really does help us out on the channel. But now, let's get into it. And firstly, we do get this little Kvostov trailer. It's only about 20 seconds long, but one of the key traits for the weapon will be that every 7th bullet will ricochet. That's certainly interesting, and we do see it taking out multiple enemies right here. Of course, we'll see how well it actually performs when we get it in game. So give us your thoughts about that. Next up though, Bungie talk about weapon changes that are coming in the Final Shape update. So firstly, we've got weapon archetypes, and Bungie say they've increased base weapon damage almost universally across a bunch of weapons, but they have decided to retire the following weapon mods in Final Shape. So boss spec, Taken, Minor, Major, and Adept Big One spec are going to be retired in the expansion. That's an interesting move. On top of that though, they say we're already happy with the damage output of exotic primary weapons and traces, so they've only slightly reduced their damage bonus versus red bars, and in most cases this means that damage output is roughly unchanged, since they will be receiving a handful of buffs that we'll talk about in a moment, but they're reducing the damage bonus versus minors from 40% to 30% with the exception of Fighting Lion. And in addition to compensating for the removal of spec mods, they say they've taken the opportunity to buff some weapon types that have languished in endgame PvE. So firstly, for pulse rifles, they're increasing base PvE damage by 20%, and the exceptions are Graviton Lance and Revision Zero's Heavy Burst mode. But otherwise, that will affect all pulse rifles in the game, so that's interesting. Then for pellet shotguns, they're getting a buff of 10%. Exceptions include Legend of Acreus, Tractor Cannon, Conditional Finality, and Fourth Horseman. Slug shotguns will see a 9% boost, with fusion rifles seeing a 7% boost except for 1000 Voices. And then for snipers, it'll be a 7% boost with the exception of Izanagi's Burden's Honed Edge and Cloud Strike's Storm. On top of that though, glaive projectiles increased by 7%, and for linear fusion rifles they moved by 5%, and then they've increased damage versus minors and red bars, and this stacks with base PvE damage. So for sidearms, trace rifles, scouts and bows, it's 20%, and for auto rifles and pulses, it's 15%. And they say this is in addition to the above buff, and Graviton Lance and Revision Zero's Heavy Burst mode are included. So pulse rifles definitely getting a big boost here, but for SMGs it'll see 10% boost, and hand cannons will be a 5% boost. On top of that, they've increased damage versus majors by 20% on trace rifles, and they've increased damage globally, including for PvP, on machine guns and swords by 7%. So some fairly big buffs right there. Let us know what you think down below. They do say though that splash damage from AdClear exotic primary weapons was overperforming in the Final Shape, combined with the damage buffs listed above, so they've reduced splash damage by 10% on Sunshot, Trinity Ghoul, Polaris Lance, and Graviton Lance. I know for some of those weapons, folks won't be excited to hear that they're getting a splash damage reduction, but we should keep in mind that some of these archetypes have been buffed globally. One of the more notable ones that it will affect in PvE though would be Sunshot, so give us your thoughts about that. But next up they say kinetic damage type weapons no longer deal bonus damage to bosses, and damage to other combatant tiers is unchanged, so a kinetic sniper and a stasis sniper rifle of the same subfamily will both deal the same damage to a boss. And they've made quality of life changes to several weapon types, so they've updated heavy, adaptive, and aggressive burst weapon intrinsic names to match burst count across all weapon archetypes. So for 2 bursts it's called heavy burst, and that includes sidearms, hand cannons, and pulse rifles. 3 burst is adaptive burst, and that's sidearms, linear fusion rifles, and adaptive pulse rifles, and then 4 burst is aggressive burst, including pulse rifles. Then in general, for scout rifles, they've updated the hipfire reticle to better show accuracy and aim assist, and for hand cannons, they say some aggressive hand cannons struggle to compete in the state of top tier examples, like Igneous Hammer, and so Krimel's dagger gets a buff right there as you can see, and it'll be the same for something new, so a couple of additional aggressive hand cannon buffs. And then for low inventory sniper rifles, they say they've increased minimum reserves from 14 to 17 shots, and with linear fusion rifles, they're reducing firing animation on adaptive bursts, and that will affect the kick and recoil for linear fusion rifles of that archetype, so they'll be a bit easier to control. And for wave frame grenade launchers, they say they're adjusting blast radius, and the size of the wave is now affected by the blast radius stat, and this will mostly impact the width of the wave, although the length and the height will also be scaled. So the default display stat has been changed from 100 to 50, where 50 represents the previous baseline, and any stat over 50 will result in a larger wave segment than what is possible right now. So overall, that's actually positive. But for special ammo wave frame grenade launchers, they're pulling back the length of the wave slightly, and they're reducing the length of the waves from 22 meters to 15 meters. That is with the exception of Dead Messenger. And then for swords, they say they've updated the sword reticle to better indicate its charge state, and when sword energy is consumed, the amount of delay the sword has before it begins to recharge now subtly appears in the reticle. They've also fixed some bugs associated with swords as well. And then we get on to exotics finally. So for Divinity, they say its ability to bypass combatant gameplay by generating a weak spot on command has been too high on uptime as it stands, and they're not changing how effective the cage is or how feathering works, but they're increasing how long it takes to generate the cage, which will make it less ammo efficient and less useful against targets that break aim frequently. So the number of shots required has been increased by 75% against combatants. So that's fairly significant. Then for Rat King, they've swapped the firing animation to be the same as the one used by other auto-fire sidearms. And for Devil's Ruin, they fixed an issue where the firing animation would get applied to other equipped sidearms if the weapon was swapped during the firing animation. And finally for Symmetry, the Catalyst now provides plus 10 reload speed, handling, as well as the Eddy Current perk in addition to its existing effects. So a slight buff there, but then we get on to Galahorn, and they say the Wolfpack rounds always look like arc projectiles, so they've updated the visuals to match the damage type of the weapon, and that means they'll use solar effects on Galahorn, and on Royal Entry, the Void Rocket Launcher, they will have void effects. On top of that, for Touch of Malice, they're increasing the duration of burn applied by the Darkness Ball against combatants from 2 to 3.5 seconds, and for Osteostriga, it now has a 4-second cooldown on the poison burst on kills, as Bungie believe it was too easy to spread poison across a whole encounter from a couple of kills. They also say that Necrochasm wasn't generally as strong as they'd like it to, so the intrinsic perk now provides increased reload speed after precision kills, and they've increased the duration of burn applied by the Cursed Thrall explosion against combatants from 2 to 3.5 seconds. Plus the Catalyst has been rebuilt, and it's now 1 for Thrall, and damaging 3 combatants in quick succession provides a period of increased damage, range, and aim assist. Then for Lament, they say the healing on hit largely removes the intended downside of using a sword for boss DPS, so they're reducing the healing effect by 20%. And while the weapon does inherit the 7% global buff to swords, they've reduced the damage of the high-end chained heavy attack by 20% from that point, and that means combos at lower stacks are less affected by the change than combos at higher stacks. So that's an interesting one. Deadman's Tale, though, also gets a bunch of changes, and they say the rapid fire fantasy isn't landing as well as we'd like, so Cranial Spike stacks now grant stability in addition to aim assist and range, and then they've increased the reload speed benefit of Cranial Spikes. And when hip firing with the Catalyst, they've slightly reduced the accuracy benefits. They've also increased magnetism fall-off scale from 1.6 to 1.7, and increased baseline rate of fire from 130 to 140 RPM, and then removed the PvE only damage buff that scaled with stacks of Cranial Spike, and added a 15% damage bonus at maximum stacks. So some interesting changes on that one. We also get colony changes though, been a long time since I used that thing, and they say it now spawns additional insectoid robots on final blows, and more robots, up to 5, will spawn from tougher combatant kills, so that one actually sounds pretty cool. Truth is also getting a buff here, and they're increasing the area of effect damage such that it doesn't lose noticeable damage due to not dealing impact damage, and they've increased the total reserves by 3, which is on top of the reserves change that we already got in a recent update. So that sounds pretty decent. Queenbreaker though, they say is outpaced by legendary linear fusion rifles, so they're increasing damage versus bosses, mini-bosses, champions and vehicles by 12%, and increasing reserve ammo by 3. Plus, they say the power from Cerberus plus 1's Focus Fire perk from the Catalyst was limited by it always being available, so Focus Fire will now activate on special reloads following a kill, and will no longer reduce range or rate of fire. And they say they're reworking the Saint's Fist perk on Bastion, and dealing damage with a melee increases your charge rate, damage, and reload speed for a short duration, and landing a majority of pellets in a burst increases melee damage, so that sounds interesting too. Ariana's Vow though has been falling behind other anti-barrier special weapons, so they say breaking a matched shield or piercing a champion's barrier will cause the target to ignite. Let us know if you think that will make the weapon more appealing. perk. They also say though that Deterministic Chaos is now intrinsically anti-barrier, and the Heavy Metal and Vexadecimal perks have had their locations and behavior swapped, so Heavy Metal now causes every 4th bullet to make targets volatile, and Vexadecimal now causes every 16th bullet to also weaken targets. And then the Fundamentals perk on Borealis, Hardlight, and Dead Messenger will now maintain its state across death or respawn, so that certainly makes it a bit more useful. And that does it for the exotic changes outlined today. Let us know your thoughts on them. A couple of decent buffs, and naturally a couple of nerfs, at least minor ones overall, but let us know what you think. And then we get on to perk changes. So finally right here, they say Alacrity will no longer work in Rumble, but also Archer's Gambit has been brought down a bit so it can be used on legendary weapons, and they've reduced the draw time buff from 66 to 60% and the buff duration from 8 to 4 seconds, but it can now stack up to 8 seconds. Grave Robber also needed some love, so it'll now activate on dealing damage with a powered melee, in addition to standard melee kills, and for chain reaction, they say it's simply too strong on special ammo weapons in the current form. So, on special weapons, it'll have around about a 15% smaller AoE size and 20% less damage, and for heavy weapons, it'll have the same AoE as before, but 30% more damage. Certainly sad about the special weapon element, although the heavy weapon side of things is positive. They also say though that Eddy Current is too slow to activate, so it now takes 1.5 seconds of sprinting to activate instead of 3, and also provides a bonus to handling and a 5% scalar on each stat at base. Plus, being amplified will immediately activate the perk at its maximum effectiveness. On top of that, for Underdog, they say instances of Underdog have been replaced with Pulse Monitor, as that perk was shelved a long time ago. Then for Osmosis and Permeability, they have some interesting build crafting potential, but they do want to improve utility, so they no longer drop off when pulling out a ghost or similar actions, and they now partially refill the weapon's magazine on activation. So that could be a slightly decent buff there. They're also adjusting the number of slow stacks applied based on properties of the weapon regarding chill clip, so rapid fire fusions like Riptide will still require 3 shots to freeze, but slower firing fusions only require 2. And they're also reworking High Ground to provide a stacking damage bonus when getting kills in any context, like Rampage, or instantly granting the maximum amount of stacks when damaging an enemy from High Ground. And for PvE, the max bonus is increased to a 25% damage bonus, and in PvP, the maximum will be 15. Lastly though, they say perks that currently match your equipped subclass have been changed, and Osmosis and Tessellation now match the damage type of your equipped Grenade, and Permeability and Elemental Capacitor now match the damage type of your equipped Super. So obviously that is for utility around the prismatic subclasses. Then for Deconstruct, they say it now refills from reserves instead of from thin air, and should trigger more reliably across weapon types. So a lot of stuff to think about right there in relation to weapon changes in the final shape, but as always, give us your thoughts on those updates in the comment section. For today, if you found the video useful though, a rating really does help us out on the channel, and also get subscribed so I can keep you posted with more Destiny content. Otherwise though, cheers for tuning in, and I will catch you guys very soon.